I think we can start. It's now 4 minutes past.
Okay.
Charlotte, you want to enter slideshow mode?
Got it.
Welcome, everyone. Charlotte and I are going to give a introductory presentation on using Python virtual environments and Requirements.txt. My name is Yamil Suárez. I've been using Python heavily since 2020, but I had used it a bit before. I work at Berklee College of Music as the Associate Director of Library Systems and Web Development. And I mostly use Python for data cleanup and management and for automation. Want to introduce yourself, Charlotte?
Yeah, I'm Charlotte Kostelic. I'm the Metadata Manager at BookOps, which is, as I'm sure most of you know, the combination of technical services for New York Public and Brooklyn Public Libraries. I've been using Python for a number of years now, but have transitioned more to using it even more heavily since starting this job back in December. So yeah, also using Python mostly for data cleanup, working with a lot of catalog data. And I'm pretty new to virtual environments, but using them heavily now. Yamil and I have learned a lot over the past couple of months as we've been preparing this presentation. So we hope other people are as excited as we are.
So here's my pitch to get you interested in wanting to use virtual environments and Requirements.txt. So don't you hate it when you can't install a new package due to a conflict with something you installed before? And using a virtual environment will help with that, among many other reasons. Another situation is when you get a new machine and don't remember which Python packages to install from your code to work. Or when you want to batch install requirements for a complex Python project, let's say you found in GitHub. If you have access to Requirements.txt file, it will help you in that situation. Next slide, please. So what are virtual environments? They are a way to separate installations of different versions of Python packages. When I install, what we call the global environment, because in Python, in most OSs, you get the central bucket, we'll call it the global environment, where all modules get installed. Now, when you use virtual environments, they end up being very lightweight, disposable, and easy to create. And when you look at them, it's just one folder with what I call stuff inside of it. And here's a link in our presentation where you can see more details of what is inside that magical folder. Next slide. So I want to clear up something that confused me very early on when I try to understand virtual environments, is that there's two, for lack of a better term, competing modules for doing virtual environments in Python. There's venv and virtual env. They're similar packages. The syntax used is very similar. They're both widely used. Charlie and I have been using venv, and we've asked some experts, like I'm based out of Boston, so I turned to the Boston Python meetup with full of some really experienced Python users, and they're like, for most beginner users, just use the built-in venv. And this presentation, we're only going to cover venv. And technically, venv is newer. It's a newer project. And since 3.3, it's been built into Python, which came out in 2012. So if you have Python already installed, you should have access to venv. But later on, we have a slide where we go into a little more details of the difference between the two, venv and virtual env. But for most situations, you can just stick to venv. Next slide, please. So why use virtual environments? And one of the simplest reasons is pip, the tool that we use to install packages, by default installs everything, what I was mentioning, that this global environment. Now, if you use virtual environments, you get to keep that global environment clean and avoid version issues in the future. Now, you may have been using Python for 3 or 4 years, and if you did not install many modules, you maybe have not had a conflict issue, but usually time is ticking the more you end up using Python. Because if you install version 1 of one module and also need version 7 in this global environment, you're only allowed to install one version. So by this time, and this has been many years, it's become a highly recommended Python community best practice to use virtual environments, especially if you're trying out some random module you saw in some blog post. I don't know if you actually want to stick around. Next slide. Now, this is a screenshot of a webcomic called XKCD. And this person has studied science, and he made a webcomic specifically talking about how messed up his local Python global environment looked like. And I saw it for years, and I realized I had to use, or he used maybe some virtual environments. It wouldn't be as messy, but it's just always thought it was a great artistic representation of how messy Python environments can get, especially if you're not using virtual environments. Next slide.
So as Yamil mentioned, you can't have more than one version of a package installed in your global environment, your global Python. But you may need to have more than one version in order to do your work. So because oftentimes with major changes, there will be breaking changes. So in my work, one example of this has come up with PyMark. And you might also see this if you are reading old Code4Lib articles. So PyMark 4, I found an example just in 2020, which seems like it wasn't that long ago. But PyMark 5 came out last year, and there were some breaking changes. So a more recent article will have the examples from PyMark 5. Also, after starting this new job, I inherited 2 projects. One, Bagel, it's used to create mark records from spreadsheets, and another toolbibs, which is doing a very similar thing. But they were developed over time, and one was created using PyMark 4, one has PyMark 5. So I basically wouldn't be able to maintain these 2 separate packages and, prioritize my time differently. I would have to go back and upgrade Bagel to PyMark 5 and make a lot of changes if I wanted to have just one version of that package installed on my computer. But instead I've used virtual environments, so I can have both. And so that everyone knows how to do this, it's super easy. We have examples in both Mac OS / Linux, and the next slide will be with Windows. But it's just a few simple commands in order to create a virtual environment. Go into the space where you want to create the virtual environment. It's one command to create it, another command to activate it, install some packages, do your work, and deactivate it. You can also easily delete the virtual environment and create a new one. It's very simple. Same number of steps on Windows, just with slightly different commands. And I will give you a live demo now. So, sorry, this is going to block the slide at the same time. And hopefully, I tried changing the font, so hopefully everyone can read this, but move into the environment where you want to create the go into the directory where you want to create the virtual environment, just listing what's there. There's nothing there. If I run pip list, you'll see what I have installed. So I don't really have much installed because I tried to use virtual environments. It's just pipx and pipx pip and what pipx needs, all of pipx's dependencies. To create a virtual environment, we're using my_benv for all of our examples, for all of our example virtual environments in this presentation. So that's, the command is Python benv, and my_benv is the name of the virtual environment that we're creating. Takes a little while. It's thinking. now would be a great time for it to just, stop working. Okay, there we go. It's created. And if I list again, you'll see now there's a new folder, myvenv. And then, so we've created the virtual environment, but it's not active yet. So don't install anything yet. You need to activate it first. And now you'll see this change to the prompt. You'll see that it is now active. That myvenv in parentheses will tell you that it's active. And now if I run pip list, you'll see that I don't have anything installed. I just have pip. So I can, install PyMark. Now it'll say got pip and PyMark. If I deactivate it, or run pip list again, you'll see I no longer have PyMark because I'm no longer in the virtual environment. So it's that simple. It's really easy to create a virtual environment. I could activate it again now. I could delete the folder and create a new one. Super easy.
Now for some general virtual environment tips. You can name your virtual environment whatever you like. You could call it Pineapple. But various editors, let's say VS Code or PyCharm, would auto-detect the more common virtual environment folder names. And these include calling it .venv or just venv. If you do not pick a common name, let's say you picked a Pineapple, you just have to manually tell whatever your editor is to auto-detect what is the virtual environment file name, folder name you happen to pick for that particular project. And it's very normal that after you do your work, you're going to end up with several virtual environments within your hard drive. Like I have like 5 production projects. Each of them have an individual virtual environment folder. Now, the 2 general approaches where to store the virtual environment folders are, the easiest one is to just save it inside the parent of your code. The parent folder for your code, then you just put it right in there, kind of like what Charlotte just demonstrated earlier. Now, sometimes you can take an approach to have like a central folder in your hard drive for all your VEMs, and there's some pluses to that, but even though I've used that, you kind of have to keep track of the full path when you do the activation, and that may be a bit of a hassle. So the simplest approach is just put it inside what the parent folder to your code. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to be hammering this several times because it's a simple mistake to make when you're using virtual environments is that you have to activate the virtual environment. So when you're creating a virtual environment, step 1 is to create that folder and you pick the name. Then step 2 is to activate. And it's once in a blue moon, I'll forget to activate. And if you start installing modules, you're going to defeat the purpose. And this can happen if you made a virtual environment last week and you want to use it this week when you start up a fresh terminal window. This week, you'd have to make sure to do the activation. If not, when you do some installations, you're going to add them to the global environment, or let's say you only have PyMark installed in your virtual environment. If you don't activate it, your code's going to complain like, we've never heard of PyMark. And that problem just means you need to activate your virtual environment in that scenario. Next slide, please. Now, the sister concept we wanted to cover in our presentation is the Requirements.txt file. This is a file that contains a list of packages and versions that are required to run some code. And here's the command to create it. It is created from the output of the pip free subcommand. And the format of the content inside Requirements.txt is a Python standard, which is usually the name of a package and an equal sign with a version number, or even just the package name. Now, you can pick any file name you want. It could be pineapple.txt, but the convention and what people expect, let's say when you visit folks' GitHub repository out in the wild, is to use requirements.txt or a variation like requirements_test.txt. And when you use this file, it leads to a simple workflow that makes it easy to batch install required packages. So you can have a complex Python project that has 30 dependencies, but with this one line pip install -r requirements.txt, Python will slowly install every single dependency in some project you're trying to set up. Next slide, please. Full disclosure, we were debating what to put on this slide, and I actually turned to ChatGPT, but we were happy with the content. So breaking down 3 generic reasons why you want to use the requirements.txt file is for what's called dependency management. Because using this file helps you manage your project dependencies by, listen them, and you can manually update to, like, let's say, from PyMac 4 to PyMac 5. So the general inventory work to maintain dependency for a project. Now, when you've done that, using your dependencies in your requirements.txt file, on a good day, you'll achieve reproducibility. Because when you specify this version in one single file, when you share this requirements.txt with others, for the most part, they'll be able to recreate what you had. Or again, when you have a situation, you get a brand new machine, if you kept up-to-date requirement.txt file, you should essentially recreate what you had before. And like I said already, you'll end up with a simplified installation of the dependency of a particular project, be it your own or somebody else's, where requirements.txt file. But here's a warning. A flaw to this requirements.txt file, you don't specify which version of Python you use to build it on your local. And that's a flaw. And that's why I hope that it gets added to this standard in the future, or that in the Python community, they pick one central solution to solve that problem of dependencies and the actual version you use to build it in your local. And one of the solutions is called Poetry, and we'll briefly mention it later on the slides. So next slide. So now Charlotte will take over.
Another live demo. So to create a requirements.txt file, first I'm going to go activate my virtual environment again. Problem with live demos is people get to see that I can't spell. And I'll install a few more packages. Maybe a package, because pandas is taking a while.
Requirements files all the way down.
Too many dependencies.
By the way, I'll say I see some great comments and questions in the chat that I want to get into all of them once we hit the end of the presentation.
Sorry, moving the window caused it to freak out a little bit. So to then create your requirements.txt file, it'll list everything that I have installed in my virtual environment. The command is pip freeze. Requirements.txt, and you'll then see that it's created this file, and then I can deactivate. And for the next demo, we can create a new virtual environment.
Oh, you're missing the M.
See, you'll have to watch me type. Thank you, Yamil.
You're welcome.
And we can install packages using that requirements.txt file that I just created. So I'll activate my Ven2. You'll see there's nothing but pip in there. And now I can use pip to install all the requirements by using the -r flag. And it will read the file and install all the dependencies listed in the file. So as you can see, it installed NumPy, pandas, see PyMark here. Still working on installing everything for pandas. I always feel like pip is so fast when I'm doing it, not when people aren't watching me do it.
By the way, Charles, would we have a moment? Can you display the contents of the requirement.txt file before you close the window when you're done?
Yes.
To show how simple a syntax on a good day can be.
Yeah. So here. This is just a VS Code.
You make that a little bit bigger,
Yeah. Oh, how do I make zoom in? So this is just you can see my two virtual environments here in this temp folder where as you can see, that's where I was in my terminal window. And this is the requirements.txt file that I output and which I just used to install the dependencies. So it's got PyMark and it's got pandas and various other dependencies for pandas. And yeah, so it lists the package and then also the exact version of the package that either it installed. So I didn't specify a version when I just did pip install PyMark or pip install pandas. And so it installed the most up-to-date one, and then it installed the dependencies based on that most up-to-date version of PyMark and pandas. Yeah, so I can deactivate my virtual environment again, and oops, yeah, and I'm back to not having pandas or PyMark installed on my computer, or in that environment, I suppose.
So we're near the end of our presentation, so we're gonna give a couple of advanced suggestions. At any given point, you can delete a event folder. Let's say you install some random model that you really like to try out, and you download it and you didn't like it, and this has happened to me. If you did a VEM, you can destroy that folder and it's no longer in your computer. But let's say it's a VEM for a project you're developing and you're running code. You want to occasionally recreate your requirements.txt file to keep up with new installations of modules for your particular project. So when you want to recreate it, or if you happen to delete your event folder, you can recreate it. So continually refresh requirements.txt file. Now I have two very specific related Git recommendations for using VEMs and virtual environments and the requirements.txt. Is that this might seem counterintuitive. You do not want to send to GitHub, for example, your raw VEM folder. That should only live in your local machine or your users' local machines. So do not include it in your GitHub repositories. And there's various reasons we can talk about later. But to make it easier, make sure you don't commit it automatically. You want to add an entry in your .gitignore file for whatever file name folder name you use for your VEM. It could be .vem, pineapple, like I said earlier. Now, on the upper end of the spectrum for Git, you do want to save your requirements.txt file in your Git repository. And that's what, and I saw in the comments, some people appreciate when they check out a GitHub repository that already has a requirements.txt, which at least gives you a heads up of what's involved in downloading that one particular project. Now, this could be a bit of work with using virtual environments, but if you have 3 virtual environments and they have some version, let's say Pandas or PyMark separately, and there's some new version of PyMark and Pandas comes out, you have to go into individual each one of those VMs and run the standard pip upgrade command, which is pip install upgrade, and when the name of that module, I realize you want to start running the latest version. So that may feel like a pain, but that's the good news and bad news of having isolated installations inside event folders. And a technique that I heard about that Charlotte started using is you can configure your local pip to only install things in a virtual environment, and it'll create one on the fly. That way you again protect your global environment. And there's still a way to override it when you specifically want to do something in your global environment, but normally you want it to default to this. So it's a advanced feature that I may eventually turn on, so make sure I don't make a mistake, but I'm glad that Charlotte is ahead of the game with that technique. Next slide. So there are some alternatives, tools, and approaches to virtual environments. For example, many folks choose to use Docker containers, and there's many benefits to using containers, but often you may use up a little more RAM, disk space, or CPU power with a Docker container that a simple VM. But again, there could be many pluses to using Docker for this and other reasons. Now, other tools that are even better than Requirements.txt and even advanced for dependency management is a tool called Poetry. A tool that I learned to use from Charlotte, even though I heard a little bit about it, is PipX, and we can have a whole presentation on PipX. And then if you're familiar with the Conda environment, Anaconda, they implement their own version of virtual environments. And I forget what they're called, and they have a simplistic syntax, so it totally works, but it'll be living in the Conda world. Something I should have added to this slide, which was mentioned in the slide, is a file called pypark.toml. That could also help with managing dependencies, and will actually keep track of which version of Python you were running. And something that also got mentioned in the comments already is a tool called PyM that automates running more than one version of Python within your computer, and it works well for Unix and Mac OS. There's a fork that they support that works on Windows, and that's called PyM. And again, if you're focused on, I want to run multiple versions of Python, another approach is to use a Docker container with different version of Python. Next slide. So I'm going to finally talk a little more about the difference between VEMP and VirtualM. VirtualM is much older because VEMP wasn't added until 2012, which also means if you, for some reason, you're stuck dealing with Python 2.0 code, 2.x, you should be able to use VirtualM back then, I believe. But VirtualM is still maintained and is used. It has some very nifty, like advanced use cases that if you're doing an advanced situation, your only choice will be VirtualM. And use it with abandon, but for basic users, the built-in VAMP should be fine. One thing is you can create a virtual env that specifies a particular version that Python will be used for that virtual environment. And I keep hearing that when you're creating a virtual environment, virtual env, it's a little bit faster when you first do the creation. And there's a product that I have not used. It's a model called pipenv, which just a mix of adding extra features to pip. And it relies on virtualenv to handle the virtual environments. So here in our slides, there's a link to more information about virtualenv. Next slide, please.
So we just have a few more resources because you get into a lot more detail with virtual environments. The official Python Venv documentation is helpful, and Yamil brought this Real Python article about virtual environments to my attention. It's very thorough. It'll go into the detail about what is actually included in all of those directories and files in a virtual environment, and also some helpful resources on using virtual environments in VS Code, especially if you're using poetry in VS Code, which was frustrating to me at different times. Also using virtual environments in PyCharm, and some additional resources, just so everyone can go back and read more in case they want to know a bit more detail. And Yamil has one less.
Yeah,
Hands
it's just
up.
a simple mistake I do once in a while, even though I've been using VEMS for more than a year, is don't forget to activate. You will forget once in a blue moon. So make sure you hit activate. The syntax is a little bit different, Windows versus Unix. And keep your requirements.txt updated as you add more dependencies to whatever your project is, or maybe you'll switch to the pyproject.toml approach, which will be a great topic for this group to go over. And that concludes our presentation. I want to say we simplified the use cases because there's many edge cases, and just general awareness of VEMF, or if I can get some of you to start using VEMF, you'll thank me later. And I definitely had to force myself like about a year ago, say I'm going to use them 100% of the time to keep my global environment clean. So we have a bunch of questions in the comments until I review them. Does anyone want to repeat them on the mic or on the chat again if something hasn't been answered yet? So going in reverse chronological order, Michael mentioned, I found that connecting an already existing pipenv environment to PyCharm is a pain. I always end up trying several things and that don't work before I finally remember how to do it. I haven't tried that yet, but thanks for the heads up. Let's see. But feel free to turn on your mic if you want to just ask a question while I review the previous comments.
It looks like there's some questions about Conda and mini Conda, and I don't have experience using Conda, but my understanding is that it like manages everything for you. So rather than installing Python and then installing packages from there, you install, like, rather than installing Python and then installing poetry, you would install Conda or mini Conda, and that installs Python for you. And it also like manages your virtual environments and your installs of different packages. So in some ways it seems like if you're committing to using Conda, then it seems like it keeps everything together for you.
I know one thing you get from Conda is you can install software that is not Python based, where pip only installs Python based packages. Now, Thomas, I don't know if you're saying that Conda will help you run more than one version of Python. I don't know if Conda itself does, but in theory, you can install Python from downloading from python.org, that's version X, and then have a complete separate version within Conda. That can be done. And so many people accidentally end up with both a manual installation of Python and a Conda installation of Python, and you have to work with your bash profile configuration. I can get a little confusing, but I don't know if Conda itself lets you run more than one version, of Python.
If I can interact, yes. When you specify when you create a new environment in Conda or mini Conda, you can specify as an argument the version of Python.
Oh, cool.
And so you can have an environment with Python 2, another one with Python 3, and like it's pretty nifty. Yeah.
I'm still scrolling around. Feel free to get on the mic if you have a particular question you want to ask.
I guess I had one. I was typing it up and then I thought, I could just hop on the mic. Are there any modules that you think work better installed globally? I mean, in my mind, I'm always using pandas for just about every project. But at the same time, I can still see cases where it would run into issues with my old work, especially where, you saw all the other modules that came with pandas when Charlotte was screen sharing. Yeah, are there any cases where you would suggest installing something globally versus in a virtual environment?
That's an excellent question. Something I had thought about, that when I get in a month, I'll get a new machine, and I plan to have a couple of modules that I use frequently, and I like to use IPython and pandas all the time. That I may strategically choose to pick one version of IPython and one version of pandas to be in my base global environment because I use it so often. And then when I'm doing something, taking a deeper dive or making a particular solution that uses pandas to clean up some data or PyMark, then I'll reinstall it in that one venv and create my requirements.txt in case my computer dies and I want to recreate. So I may end up installing more than once. Now, there's an advanced feature of venvs, and I'm sure this appears in virtual env, that I could tell it to detect something installed in my global environment. And I slowly been starting to play with that, because there's a config file inside that folder with stuff for virtual environment. If you give me a moment, I could try to track it down when you set some variable from false to true. So you make a new venv and like, oh, I want to use pandas, and I have it in my global because that's one of my go-to tools. I could send that to true, and then I should be able to access pandas. I hope that made sense, and maybe it'll help if I show an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Thanks.
And John just mentioned in the chat that pipex can be used to install packages globally, but still in a container. And that's what I was thinking. Like, for example, Poetry is installed. I had to use pipex to install Poetry because it sits completely separate from everything else installed on my machine. So there's some things that you may want to use for everything, and pipex will allow you to keep those packages completely separate.
Yeah, so pipex, sorry.
Go ahead.
So pipex does this nice sweet spot of, it's like a venv that can be called globally. A virtual environment can be called globally, but it only makes sense, as I read into it, for commands. Like I'm using it for the code formatting command in Python called black, because I'm expected to type in black in my command line and trigger it. So pipex, that's why, and we could have a whole presentation just on pipex, and I don't mind. And I thank Charlotte for nudging me to start using it. Again, it's meant for tools that you run directly in the command line. I cannot start a new Python code file and type import black, because it's not truly installed in my global space. It's done in this like little corner just reserved for pipex. Again, this is why we simplified the use cases for this presentation. I only briefly mentioned pipex just to give some people a baseline, and we should definitely have more advanced presentations, and it doesn't have to be by us or Charlotte for some of these other tools. Going in the order of release, most recent, yes, Brooks, so virtual env, like Brooks says, you can tell it if you want to include what I call the site package, your global space. When you create a virtual env with venv, you can do that creation. Hey, please include the global packages. But you can in venv, and I'm sure in virtual env, you can probably tweak a config file to set it true or false, so you can decide after the fact.
Ed mentioned that globally installed modules aren't available in a venv, and that's also why you might need to upgrade pip every time you create a new virtual environment, because it's going to use the version of pip that came with the Python that you installed, but maybe you've upgraded pip. but it's going to be an older version of pip in every new virtual environment.
So yeah, to add question, yes, by default in a VEMF, global models aren't available by design, but at creation, you can put a flag to include them. I mean, they won't be added to your VEMF folder. They'll just be accessible. And there's a config file inside your VEMF folder you can turn on and off to include them after the fact. But yeah, it makes sense for virtual env and VEMF. You normally don't want the global space. You want something that just shows what's installed in that particular folder to control your dependencies. And the topic of dependency management, or how to properly deploy your Python project, let's say in somebody else's machine, that should be could be a 2-hour presentation. We're dancing around it by just putting these two concepts, VEMF and Requirements.txt, as limited as it is, but just to give everyone a baseline. Oh yes, pip is always releasing a new version. Drives me crazy. Any questions we haven't addressed yet? Sorry, I had a hard time. If you want, I can demonstrate that one config file. It can turn on and off in VEMF. I don't know which one it is in virtual env yet. Fine.
Sure. I can stop sharing if you want to share.
Yeah, I gotta set up a. I'm in a new folder. I can't type either. This folder was empty before. This is what it looked like. Now it has a folder. If you look inside, this is a file that we can edit. And here, include system site packages is set to false. So if I do pip, oh, I forgot to activate. You see? Now you saw my full list of everything that's on my machine, because I don't run as tight a ship as Charlotte. Do you see how the prompt changed? And it matches whatever folder name you picked. There's a way to customize that creation for VAMP. So now if I do pip, and on an older version of Python, it'll always show setup tools and pip. In Python 3.12, setup tool is not set up by default. And if I switch this to true and hit save, I should be able to access, I think pip3 list will still show. Yeah, it will now show all of them because I included the site packages. But if I set this to false, but normally this is done at creation. But I liked in my Boston Python meetup, they had a whole presentation about 2 months ago on virtual environments, and here's how I learned that trick, that I could change it dynamically. So now we're back to only looking at what I had installed so far, which is only the 2 defaults, pip. Now we're 11:49. Usually we try to wrap around 11:45, but I can stick around till noon if we want to delve into a different topic, or let me catch up with any other comments or questions. So I had some comments that I want to clarify, and he's right that Virtualenv was built first, and it was supported for many years, and then they agreed, the Python community agreed to get some ideas they like from Virtualenv and add it into the as a default into the Python language. But Virtualenv has kept adding new features over the years. And that's why we say that VEMP is a subset of always the features you end up getting in Virtualenv, because that development has kept going. And I know that, for example, if I start adopting pipenv or poetry, which I may do, especially poetry, I'm hoping to learn more for poetry from Charlotte and other groups I'm trying to work with, that I'll be eventually installing Virtualenv, because poetry relies on it, and so does pipenv. So we can share the recording later of this presentation, and we'll post a slide. I wish I had this presentation when I started, because I wasn't getting them at first, virtual environments. So I hope this was save you time and a hassle that I wish I had back. But I like sharing. I've learned so much from this group, and I want to continue us growing together. Unless there's any additional question, we'll start wrapping up, and I'll post the slides in our channel, and eventually the recording. I don't know if I'll store recording in the Berklee cloud or in the Rice cloud. And feel free to suggest other topics in the future, like how to use poetry, or just all the pitfalls about dependency management and deploying on your coworker's machine or some random stranger's machine. It's a tricky subject, and good news, bad news, that a couple different options in Python, and it just feels like we have to keep learning some new short name of a tool like pipex, pyenv, pipenv. It all seemed Greek to me, but I'm slowly learning more of those various versions. So thank you. I guess we could probably wrap up. Any final comments, Charlotte?
I don't think so. I guess just to say, if anyone is interested in any of these topics, highly recommend working with someone else on a presentation, because I've learned so much from Yamil through this process, and it's a very good experience to present on something maybe you know something about, but someone else will know other things about that topic. So highly recommend.
Thank you for saying that. No, I definitely learned a bunch of stuff from Charlotte. It was great to work together on this. Well, have David, if you're still around, you want to say a final thing? I don't know if we have any scheduled presentations, but feel free to suggest topics on the Slack channel, or volunteer with me, with Charlotte, with other colleagues, because it's great to learn as a group.
Yeah, no final comments here. There aren't any scheduled presentations, but there are a couple topics and people that I need to connect with. So I'll probably be doing that on Slack over the next week or two. The next session will just kind of be an open one where we can talk about anything Python related. There's some cool projects that I've got cooking up in my shop. Hopefully other people are working on some neat stuff.